Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rational Female Podcast. And today we've got a great guest, retired English professor Janice Fiamengo. She is a wonderful lady. I'm so happy to have her here on the channel today. And yeah, so Janice, I would like you to first of all just introduce yourself, tell us a bit about yourself and how and why you started to research feminism.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. And I was most primarily interested in English literature in my early years as a college student. And so I wanted to major in literature. And then I went on to do my master's degree and then ultimately my PhD. I knew from a long time that I wanted to be an academic. And, I hoped to have a permanent job as an academic and to teach other students about how wonderful it is to read and think about stories and what they mean and how they affect us and all of that. And so feminism was just when I was a student, I started university in 1982. Feminism was already a major force in the universities. I graduated with my BA in 1986. I did my MA from 86 to 88 and started my PhD in 1991 after teaching at college for a couple years. And at that time, feminism was the major critical lens through which literature was read and understood. And so I think it would have been impossible to avoid it. And I found it very attractive and compelling. And so this has now shaped my worldview for the last 30 plus years, is the awareness of how compelling the feminist worldview is. And then ultimately I came to realize how false it is. I think it is compelling because it appeals to, I think, a natural tendency amongst women to feel themselves aggrieved in some way and to be attracted to the notion of our victimhood, our heroic, innocent victimhood. It means that we are not responsible for anything that's wrong in our lives. The patriarchy is responsible for that. That's an extremely compelling and I think even exhilarating worldview. And I certainly found it attractive. Now, it's also attractive to men, I think, because men have a tendency to feel for women, to empathize with them, to pity women, to believe that women's suffering is much greater than men's, and to want to protect women and soothe them when they're in distress. So I read a lot of feminist theory, including the most radical feminists in the late 1980s, Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, Robin Morgan, Gloria Steinem, all those people I read deeply. I studied feminist literary criticism and feminist theory in general. And it really wasn't until the late 1990s that I started to question it, because I could just see that it wasn't true, that men were not interested in dehumanizing, objectifying and oppressing women, and that women in fact had enormous power in our modern society and had it in the past. I studied women who made their careers as writers, public speakers, social reformers, advocates, etc., in the 19th century. And I expected to find that they struggled against great odds, that they met all sorts of opposition, that men were sneering and belittling in their attitudes. And that wasn't the case. Women were social leaders in the 19th century. They were listened to with respect. Politicians deferred to them. They changed the laws when women demanded that they be changed. They were concerned about women's higher education, about women's health, about their well-being and rights in marriage. So the idea that men didn't care about women and that the plight of women was something, that only other women, valiant and struggling, could attend to, was simply not the case. And so that was when I started revising my sense of what feminism told me about the past, and then obviously also about the present. And so that's what brought me kind of to my present moment, when I started to think that it was lousy to be a young man in a society that continually tells young men that they have to bear the burden of responsibility and guilt for hundreds of years of oppression of their sisters, that they should take a step back and let their sisters lead, and at the same time tells women that they are, these wonderful heroines of resistance, and that they can tell their victim stories and be listened to. They can make all sorts of demands. They can behave very badly in both their public and their private lives, and they'll get a pass for it because they're oppressed. And I thought it occurred to me that that's really bad. It's bad for women themselves. I think feminism makes women their worst selves. It encourages us to give in to all our worst impulses. And it's bad for men, obviously. Men should not grow up bearing this burden of guilt. They should not feel sexual self-loathing. They should not feel responsible for female suffering. I thought that was terrible. And I thought what feminism has done in driving a wedge between men and women, encouraging women to behave badly, it has really harmed society overall. We no longer really focus on how do we make the best society, a society that's stable, that allows for individual flourishing, and that is a good society for children to grow up in. We no longer talk about any of those things. Every single item we evaluate is it good for women? Is it what women want? The last thing we should be talking about is what women want. We should be talking about how women and men can work together to be the best citizens they can be and to make the best society that we can make. So that was how I turned against feminism so vehemently and started investigating it more fully.
Well, that is absolutely fantastic. What a wonderful way to introduce yourself. I mean, honestly, I couldn't agree more. That's really the main crux of what I say. So I'm going to be a bit nitpicky now. I want to ask something kind of funny. So a lot of feminists talk about how women were sexually repressed historically and how women were oppressed by their husbands. They couldn't have bank accounts. And I was watching The Sopranos. It's a show that I like a lot. And there's this episode where the men they kind of snark at the idea of female sexual pleasure. And I know this is a very, very contentious topic within feminism, particularly liberal feminism. So do you think that women historically were ever oppressed in any kind of meaningful sense? And do you think that when it comes to female sexuality, do you think women's sexuality was policed and controlled and repressed? Or do you think that this is just a feminist lie?
I don't believe that feminism tells us anything true. So whatever feminism claims about the past, I think we should assume that it isn't true and investigate it. It's very difficult to do that kind of investigation because most histories now are written from a feminist point of view. So if you read a history book, it will tell you that women were oppressed. If you ask Chat GPT, when women were first allowed to get bank accounts, for instance, or I haven't investigated the bank account issue. All I can say about that is that it absolutely does not make sense. Women were business owners in the 18th century. Women were independent actors in their lives. They wrote books. They were teachers, they were religious leaders, they were entrepreneurs, they did all sorts of things. Victoria Woodhull in 1872 in the United States was put forward as the presidential candidate by the Equal Rights League in the United States. How could she have done that? How could women have done all these things if they had no way to keep track of their funds? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I haven't investigated that myself. I did investigate the business about women's credit cards, whether women were allowed to have credit cards, because I saw that recently on a feminist podcast, a woman claiming, oh, we weren't allowed to have our own credit cards until the 1970s. I asked ChatGPT, when were women allowed to have credit cards? It told me 1974. I thought, really? My mother had credit cards in the 1960s. How can it be that they weren't allowed to have them, according to ChatGPT? I investigated it intensely. It's very difficult to get at the absolute reality, but it seems that women were sometimes denied credit cards in special cases. For example, if a married woman applied for a credit card, she would often be granted that credit card in her husband's name if she could not show that she had her own independent income stream. Of course, if one thinks about it, this is not oppression. This is simply common sense on the part of the issuer of the credit card. You don't want to give a credit card to somebody who doesn't make her own money. Her husband is going to be the one who pays the debts. Therefore, you want to get her husband's signature on her application as a guarantee that he is willing to pay her debts. This is simply a reality of life from the mid 20th century, when many women didn't work when they were married. They worked in the home. They didn't work for independent pay, of course. And so naturally, if you were a bank and you were issuing a credit card, you want to make sure that credit card debt was going to be paid. So this was not oppression. This was just, the reality of gender roles, which, as I've always felt, evolved naturally according to the exigencies of survival and the biological realities of men and women's lives and their natural tendencies and interests. So I don't think those women who were getting credit cards in their husband's name as, Mrs. John Smith, I don't think those women were oppressed. Many of them didn't think of themselves as oppressed. They were going out and buying things for the home, and their husband was paying for that. And that was the arrangement. So as so often the case, I think what feminism tells us, it paints a false portrait of the past so that women feel resentment when they think about their roles, and they feel that men are responsible, that men owe them something for that past oppression. And that's really too bad. To go into the subject of women's sexual repression, that's a very interesting topic. I don't, I'm not an expert by any means. I mean, I think sexuality is best repressed, quite frankly, to the extent that if we all did whatever we felt like doing sexually or otherwise at any moment of the day, we'd make a real mess of our lives. And, certainly for since the beginning of time, we have repressed male sexuality. And everybody agrees, men and women both, that male sexuality is best. Let's not call it repressed. Let's just say contained and controlled in the interests of social flourishing. And the same, I think, applies to female sexuality. I don't think we should be encouraging women to experiment sexually or to see promiscuity as some form of empowerment. That's just my personal view. But when you look back, I'm really, if I'm an expert at all, I guess I'm an expert in the 19th century, because that was where I did my PhD work and a lot of my, once I was an academic, my academic research. There were all sorts of manuals for married men in the 19th century, encouraging them to care very much about women's sexual pleasure. You can find manuals where married men are told in no uncertain terms that they should not initiate sexual interactions within marriage. They should let their wives be the initiators. They should always make sure that their wives are the active agents in their sexual life. And, there was a lot of warning to men about the need not to be abusive, not to allow their own desires to dictate what happened in the bedroom. So the notion that men didn't care about women's sexual experience or their sexual pleasure is, again, completely false. There were utopian communities in the 19th century that were built around the idea of guaranteeing or caring about female sexual pleasure. For instance, in 1848, there was an organization called the Oneida Community. I think that's how you pronounce it. It was in New York, and it was a utopian Christian communist society. It operated on the principle of everyone sharing everything in common, including their sexual lives. So it believed that every man was married to every woman and vice versa. It prioritized female sexual pleasure. Younger men were initiated into sexual practice by older women. It operated on the principle of male sexual continence. In other words, men did not ejaculate during sexual intercourse. They waited until afterwards in order to control reproduction. And it was, women, children were raised by the whole community. The society had, I think, about 250 individuals in it. And eventually it disbanded some decades after it was first formed, because ironically, because a lot of the young people wanted to practice conventional marriage. I think people do want to mate up with a single other person, not to have sex with a whole bunch of different people. And they especially want to have children with one person and raise them together, not have them raised by other people. But again, the fact that that existed, and that female sexual autonomy and female sexual pleasure were foregrounded in their ideals of what the community would stand for, indicates to me that that was always a concern. For at least in the West, in the English speaking world. I don't know about other cultures. I couldn't speak for them. So I've done so much thinking about whether there's anything true in the feminist story, and I think especially like, what do we even mean by the term oppress? Do we mean treating another group cruelly, treating them unkindly, being unjust? I just don't think that is the case. I think that men in successful cultures have tended to care very much about the well-being of women, so that sometimes when we look at something that seems like oppression, if we twist it and look at it from a feminist viewpoint, was actually an attempt to protect women.
No, I completely agree. Yeah, again, such fantastic ground covered. The ChatGPT comment was interesting because I asked ChatGPT something about that, and it gave me, because my ChatGPT has specialized instructions because it actually helps me with my YouTube videos. And occasionally, if I don't give it any context, it will just like reiterate a bunch of feminist jargon. So that's quite interesting. But yeah, I really agree that, societies are much better when people have one-on-one relationships. I think we see that's much better for society, and it's better for women as well because, yeah, but anyway, I don't want to diverge too much into that. So this actually leads me on to something very interesting to ask you now. Do you actually think that anything positive has come out of the feminist movement? Like women have financial independence and career success, which, by the way, I personally don't think is a bad thing. I don't think it's bad for women to have any careers. I don't think it's bad for women to, be politicians or doctors or writers. I myself, I'm a fiction author. You're an academic, or were an academic. So, do you think anything positive? And to kind of just run on that, my view, I generally say that many successful women throughout history have existed, and innovations in the 20th century, like birth control and kitchen appliances, which were actually invented by men, were what helped to have women be able to, flourish and have careers outside of the home. And, there was Hollywood, for example, there were actresses like Hedy Lamarr, who pioneered the invention of GPS and Wi-Fi, and, Rita Hayworth and Elizabeth Taylor, Marilyn Monroe. Like, it's not like women in the prior to even the second wave feminist movement were all just changed to the kitchen sink. So do you think that feminism makes us feel like we should attribute all of women's success to feminism, or do you think no, feminism actually has done women some good? What do you think about that?
Yes, that's a very good question. And it's one that I often think about, and it's worthy of a longer answer, probably, that we'll even be able to give it here. I think I agree with where you were going with your comments, that we often attribute to feminism much more than it deserves. So my short answer is, did anything good come out of feminism? Well, I think it showed us something about female nature. It showed us something about female vainglory, resentment, tendency to believe themselves victims, resentment against men, over emotionalism, unwillingness to take responsibility or to be accountable for wrongdoing. So all those things were useful, but whether it actually did good for women overall, that wouldn't have come about in the course of time, or that was already coming about in the course of time, such as financial independence, achievement, autonomy, etc. No, I don't think it did any of those things. I think it takes false credit for those things. Long before women had the right to vote, long before there was any sort of feminist movement, there were all sorts of independent women making contributions to their society. So just to be, they ran businesses, they did all sorts of things. They were authors. and influencers. And they were highly respected for that. I guess what I would say about that is that did feminism do any good? It's a very complicated thing in the sense that my position is that I would not want anyone to be prevented from bringing their gifts to the society, from making an invention that's going to help people, from running a business that's going to be productive, from writing a book. Obviously, I was able to do what I wanted to do in my life, and I wouldn't have wanted someone to tell me you can't become a university professor because of your sex. So there's that. I also, though, I am very hesitant about the idea of women being in positions of absolute power over men, or really controlling societies to a great extent, in the sense that certainly at the present time, it doesn't seem to me that women have some of the qualities that are necessary for really profoundly good leadership, which would include, to me, a lack of bigotry towards the other sex, the willingness to sacrifice, and the ability to take absolute responsibility for their own mistakes. It seems to me that men have developed those abilities because those have been necessary for men to achieve status in their societies. And also, I think it's just built into men that men do care about women. Men have consistently, as you pointed out in saying, it was men that created birth control. Men, from as soon as they could, tried to make childbirth safer and less painful for women. They created all sorts of devices, as you pointed out, to make women's labor more efficient and less dangerous to the women. So, and I don't see that women have a corresponding overall concern for men. And I don't know, like, it's possible, I think, that is actually built into female nature, that because of evolutionary biology, not that I am an expert in that, but that, the women evolved to care primarily about their own physical safety and security and that of their children, whereas men evolved to be concerned about women's physical safety and that of their children. Men competed in order for status and therefore access to women, and men are driven biologically, sexually, emotionally to care for women. I don't see that women are driven to care for men. Some women are, certainly, but I just don't see it overall. And I think the modern feminist movement really demonstrates that women will vote in and advocate for policies that harm men without a second thought. I have spoken to so many women, not feminist women necessarily, who laugh at the thought of male pain and disability, or who simply dismiss it, contemptuously. Oh, cry me a river, white boy. Too bad. And the idea is, you oppressed us for centuries. Now it's your turn to suffer if you are suffering. You try to bring up issues of male disadvantage to the ordinary woman, and certainly the feminist woman. If you point out that suicides are 80% male, incarceration is something like 97% male. Homelessness is 80 to 85% male. Early death from alcoholism or drug addiction is 80% male. They don't care. It is very difficult. It's extremely difficult to get women interested in any form of male suffering. If you point out that affirmative action hiring is legalized discrimination against men who never in themselves benefited from any of the claimed oppression of the past. It's just class vengeance is what it is. If you point that out, they don't care. It doesn't bother them. Whereas I don't know any men who don't care about female suffering. And I don't think the history, certainly in the West, again, I can't speak for other cultures, I don't think the history of Western civilization shows men not caring about women's suffering. So that is my concern about female power. I think that I'm just not, I don't trust women to care about the good of society overall. I think women have an inbuilt female preference that is socially harmful. So to that extent, I am wary of female power. So I'm in this sort of awkward position where I don't want to deny any talented woman the right to contribute her gifts, but I'm not super enthusiastic about a female president or female leader or general female predominance in really powerful positions. I think women need to be trained to um, get control over those aspects of female nature that I just talked about: aversion to accountability, vainglory, resentment, grievance, over emotionalism. I think we really need to raise up a generation or two or 10 of women who control those aspects of female nature. It's interesting when people used to debate whether women voting was a good idea. The issues that would be brought forward, and they were brought forward by both men and women who loved women. It wasn't that they hated women and didn't want them to vote because of that. They loved women. They continually advocated for women's higher education and women's rights in marriage and all of those issues. And by the way, I mean, if you look at the historical record, women, just looking at the UK situation, for example, women entered Girton College in Cambridge in 1869. So we're not talking about a society that didn't believe that women should be able to become educated. When women were licensed as doctors in the UK starting in the 1870s. So that's not exactly a society that oppressed women. This is long before women had the right to vote. But during these discussions about whether women could vote, one of the issues was, like, do women really want to vote? Like, are women really interested in national and international affairs? And some of the critics said, women tend to be focused on the day-to-day of their household, and they're interested in personal issues. And even today, women are interested in tabloid news, they're interested in the weather, they're interested in natural disasters, they're interested in fashion, they're interested in male-female relations, what the Kardashians are doing, etc. They're not that interested in national and international affairs. And so the concern was that women would vote on the basis of emotion, on whether they liked or disliked a politician. They would tend to vote for policies that they like, that increase their security. So you'd get a bloated government that was quite wasteful, that drew on mostly male taxpayer dollars and wasted a lot of them, and that involved a lot of busybody legislation that probed into people's private lives in ways that were not productive. And I think they were not wrong. I mean, that's what we tend to have now as a result of the way that women vote. I do think that politics has become far, well, I don't know if it ever really was, but it's become more and more emotional and demagogic. And it's hard to argue with the critics who said that women would be voting on the basis of relatively little information or understanding of economic systems or the political process or international relations. Now, of course, not all men are geniuses in those regions either, but men in general tend to take those issues more seriously than women do. So again, that's sort of that's the problem. I think you mentioned you consider yourself an egalitarian. I don't know what I am really. I'm more on the conservative side, I think. But as a woman, obviously, like, I was given every opportunity, and I'm grateful that I was given all of those opportunities to better myself. And I wouldn't want to take those opportunities away from women, but I don't see a lot of gratitude on the part of women, and that worries me. As women have more power, more opportunities, more special perks and privileges, they seem to get more angry, and to demand even more than they did 100 years ago, when essentially they achieved equality, political and legal equality with men. So yeah, so I'm pretty wary about uh, female power, I think. And what I would like to see, I think now, I mean, obviously, I don't think that the right of women to vote or that's not under threat. That's not going to be taken away. It was a dubious gain, I think. I don't think it's made politics better. Um, would I give up my vote? Maybe. I would if I thought it would be for the greater good. I have to say I don't really trust women with power, and but what I would like to see going forward is an absolute end to this notion that men owe women something, and that we should be organizing our cultures around the question of what'll make women happy. Every poll and survey that's been done over the last 2 or 3 decades shows that women are becoming increasingly less satisfied with their lives, less happy. And the answer is always, well, we need more feminism. We need to do more for women. But I think actually, we need to stop. No more affirmative action. No more excuses. No more special perks and privileges. Let's hold women accountable for their behavior. Let's treat them equally under the law. They are not treated equally now. There was a huge study by American professor of criminology called Sonia Starr, who found that women are treated far more leniently under the law. The sentences for similar crimes with men are 63% lighter than men receive, and they're treated differently all the way through the criminal process, from arrest through trial, through sentencing, everything treated leniently. I say, this is really dangerous, and okay, let's hold women to the same standard of accountability that we hold men, and let's hold them to the same standard in terms of fairness and equality and compassion for the other sex. I don't see that happening, and that's why I believe that anti-feminism, unlike feminism, which claims that it's the radical idea that women are human.
Yeah.
If men ever thought that women weren't human, come on. I mean, at worst, men thought women were angels. They idealized them. Maybe that's something that feminism has done for us, in that it has disabused many of us of our idealized versions of what women are. So anti-feminism is the radical idea that women are adults. So
I love that. That is brilliant. Wow. Yeah. So we're coming to the end, maybe a few more minutes. I just want to, you said again, you've really spoken so well. I mean, I just want to give you a big round of applause, honestly. Yeah, it's interesting because I've had some very, very negative experiences in my life with both males and females in very different contexts. And I feel like if I was to tell somebody, if I was to describe somebody what a guy did to me, they say, "Oh, that's awful." But if I was to describe them what a female friend did to me, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if I was to say, I had this friend and they did this, 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 and this, they would just not say anything. And I think that's really bizarre. I think that it's very sad. And I do remember actually when we last spoke a few years ago, when you said to me, how if you go on Google, there are so many images of men rescuing a woman from a burning building, but there's no images of women doing that for a man. I mean, I did think maybe you would do that for your son. I would like to think that a woman would do that for her son. I think,
yes.
but at the same time, I guess your default as a woman is say, I've got to call a man, call a fire brigade or something. So yeah, I also want to make it very clear, and this is something which I do say, I'm not someone who's here to say, men are all inherently good or where it's all women's fault. I think there are some definitely dangerous men out there. There are men out there who don't care about women. The problem is there are also women out there who don't care about men. And it's become more ubiquitous in our culture. And, the examples you gave about women laughing at male suffering, it's really exhausting. And these are women who wouldn't say they're a feminist. They would say, "Oh no, I'm not a feminist." But it's like we have just become so socially conditioned to laugh at men. And
Yeah.
it's like enough now. I mean, it's different, but is it different? Like, we shouldn't be like that with anyone. It's just lame, and it's sexism, it's misandry. It's this culture of misandry. And if you're dealing with a guy you don't like, just stop talking to him. You don't need to, start going on about how terrible all men are, because honestly, like, women can be very, very bad too. And it's awful. Why are we painting it as it's all men's fault? We should be saying exactly what you said. We have to hold women accountable. And I think anti feminism, as you said, it's really just looking at women as adults. It's not about saying that it's all women's fault. I'm not someone who would say that. It's about telling women to take responsibility and stopping this gynocentrism, this hatred of men, and also this lack of looking at, women's historical contributions in their own right. So, yeah, honestly, I did want to ask one more thing, but I would wonder if you would like to stop now, or if you're okay with the call.
No, sure. One last thing is fine.
Yeah, because you did a great video on Jane Austen, and obviously you studied a great deal of classical authors. So Jane Austen, from the video, from what I gauged, you said that she actually wasn't a feminist. Louisa May Alcott was a feminist. So could you just tell me a bit about the kind of female authors that you studied, and why you would say Jane Austen was not a feminist? Because I'm sick also of any woman who has been successful historically now being called, like, I love Sylvia Plath, for instance. She was not a feminist. She never called herself a feminist, from what I know. I could be wrong, but Sylvia Plath was a poet. She was very, very unhappy, but she was not someone who seemed aligned with feminism in any way. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know. I agree with you. I hate that tendency to now we have to look back, and every woman who did anything with her life, she must have been a feminist, and so we have to reinterpret everything that we know about her through the feminist lens. I mean, there's all sorts of recreations of Jane Austen novels, for example, which try to turn her into a revolutionary and a radical, a feminist radical, and it's just so unfair. Please let us just look at people from the past on their own terms, and just seek to understand their worldview and values instead of always imposing a modern perspective. I can't stand that. I don't know that much about Louisa May Alcott. I read her books when I was a kid, but I never studied her for some reason. But Austen, I think, is a fascinating case of someone one might expect to be a feminist. She did have disabilities in her life, in the sense that like, she was always dependent on the goodwill and generosity of male family members for pretty well everything that she had in her life. She did not have financial independence. She always lived with family members because she didn't marry. So one would kind of have expected there might be a little bit of resentment there. And yet it seems to me that all of her novels articulate quite a conservative vision of what is necessary for women to be virtuous. And she believed, as I do too, that had to do with repressing the unruly, chaotic, emotional energies that all of us as women are aware that we possess, and disciplining those according to a very strict framework of rational self-control, fortitude, forbearance, patience, all the classical virtues, humility, loving kindness, all of those. And that's what she shows her heroines having to learn in order to take their place in society and to be productive members of their society, is to repress the things that will destroy family happiness and social well-being, to learn not to be vain, not to be selfish, not to give vent to anger and resentment, but to be patient, to be kind, to be self-disciplined, to think rationally, to be grateful, to have forbearance. And yeah, the novels really speak to me in that sense. They are not revolutionary. They're about attaining adulthood and maturity for women and what that looks like. And I think and she had a lot of gratitude for men too, for what men do in the world, the risks that men take. She shows that very clearly in her novels, and in her personal life. Many of her brothers, a couple of her brothers joined the Navy. They risked their lives. She knew many men who died in war. I mean, she lived during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, so she understood the pain and suffering of men's lives, and she honored them for their courage and their risk taking and their protection of women. So to me, she's a very wise woman who led a, I think, quite difficult life, and yet never felt sorry for herself. And that would be, I mean, that's what I hope for my own life. I'd like to never feel sorry for myself again, because I think that's a feminine weakness that yeah. And I agree so much with you about how, yeah, there are good and bad in both men and women. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And so my anti-feminism is certainly not about idealizing men or pretending that men are without fault and all women are evil or anything like that. Not, that couldn't be further from my interest. But I think the thing is that we do not, in our society, we do not pretend that men are perfect. We fully recognize that men's
Yeah,
aggression,
absolutely.
that bellicosity, we know the dark side of men, and we have created
Absolutely.
social structures to control it. And men themselves are fully aware. You ask a man, what is a good man? They know what it is, the difference between a good and a bad man.
Yeah.
Women, I don't know anymore. And that's
No,
it.
no,
We've
no.
created a philosophy where women are innocent. And if they do bad things, it's because they were victimized. If they kill their husbands, it's because they were victims. If men kill their wives, nobody thinks, oh, well, it's because he was a victim. So we have such a double standard, and I think it's a really dangerous one. And so, yeah, let's get a single standard that recognizes the differences between men and women, of course, but let's have a standard of virtuous conduct that we apply to both men and women, so that both can be adults and make a contribution to our society. So yeah, that's my final word, I guess.
Well, fantastic. And I couldn't agree more. I think adults should strive for virtue, rational. I personally wouldn't use the word repress. That's just a personal choice. I'd probably use the word like manage or temper
Mm,
or work through. That's just me being a bit nitpicky. But yeah, I think that, part of maturity and being a mature adult is learning to take accountability. And, honestly, this has been such a fantastic discussion. I really, really love talking to you, and I think your work is so important. And I wish that more people could hear what you had to say, because if people actually listen to, anti-feminism, they would hear that like being an anti-feminist is not saying that women are terrible. It's saying that women should be held to the same standards as men in our affairs, and that everyone should strive to behave, virtuously. I'm someone who very much advocates, I would say, I believe in virtue ethics. So the morality of character, that's my ethical framework. But yeah, anyway, we're going to be closing off now. Thank you everyone so much for tuning in. Janice is such a great person, and I will be live again in a few days with another guest. So thank you everyone, and take care.
thank you.